was with visceral loathing and an almost inexplicable lack of irony that in 1580 the French ambassador to Constantinople, Jacques de Gemini, reported on the activities of the English ambassador, William Harborne, to his master, Henry III. He declared, "What has gained the said Englishman the most favour among the people here is that he brings a great quantity of steel and pieces of broken images of bronze and brass to make artillery, and that he has promised to bring more for the future, which is a contraband odious and pernicious to all Christendom." The English were not only trading with the Turks, not only selling items with a barely concealed military application, but in fact, literally brazen act of anti-Catholicism, they were selling the metalwork from desecrated churches in England to be turned into munitions that would be turned on Catholic Spaniards. The sheer malice informing what Gemini observed, what a later English ambassador would dismiss as setting one of God's enemies against the other, the infidel against the idolater, should not, however, obscure the fact that while the English offered material support for the Ottomans' war with the Spanish, they were not, and never were, military allies. The French, by contrast, had been military allies of the Ottomans, and through their joint operations though their joint operations had in the main been hampered by the profound mismatch in the allies' respective military capabilities, they were implicated in a number of really devastating raids by Ottoman fleets on Western European shores between 1537 and 1558. Now, if Gemini had temporarily or conveniently forgotten this in 1580, those who lived through these years could not and did not. And so the question that I am interested in answering is, what were the strategies used by the French for justifying alliance with the Ottomans at home and abroad? Now, full military alliance with the Ottomans was rare among Christian powers in this period. Only the French actually made a full military alliance, and then only for a short time. But there was a perceived need for justification for this, and the rhetorical powers of French diplomats were very much put to the test by it. The Ottomans were widely viewed, certainly presented at the time by the emperor and the pope, as a threat to all Christendom. The fall of Constantinople and the subsequent collapse of the Kingdom of Hungary enhanced this perception, leading to widespread calls for a united Christian, particularly Catholic response, and new crusades. And that was particularly so in the then new technology of print. Ultimately, and you've got a little statistic on there taken from Carl Gullner's Turkica, which is a collection of, or rather a survey of printed items from 1500 to 1600 on the perceived Turkish threat and the respective proportions of them that were printed in different parts of Europe. Ultimately, the popes failed to mobilize Europe in crusade, but that did not diminish the ardor with which such action was called for, or indeed European interest in Turkish affairs. If we can accept it as an index of interest, what contemporary print reveals is that perceptions were, as you might expect, more geographically determined rather than being uniform. There was much more interest in Germany and Italy rather than there was in France. And this is probably the reason for those of you that know about Luther's perception of Islam. Although Protestantism facilitated the development of a much more supple relationship with Islam in England and the Netherlands, Luther himself, as a German, felt the need to oppose Islamic doctrine and support the emperor's war against the Turks, even as he divided the German people religiously. You may notice the comparatively low rate of publications in France. What you find there is that public interest tended to be focused on particular events. The siege of Vienna, the siege of Malta, the Battle of Lepanto. After 1535, it should be remembered, France was more or less immune from Ottoman attack, though later it found itself frequently at war with the Ottomans' North African dependencies. So the sense of imminent danger really stopped after 1535. It was much weaker there. Even so, the point that I'm trying to make is that the idea of the Ottomans as an existential threat to Christian society was very much the dominant framework within which discourse about the Ottomans took place in Europe in this time. And within this context, the justificatory efforts of French diplomats and French propagandists were made. So when the French actually reached out to the Ottomans, of course, the shock was real. And individuals in royal service had to strive to convince not only foreign powers, but indeed themselves of the validity of the exercise. Hence, a component of my study will be the discussions of the alliance in the memoirs of those who facilitated it. Tentatively, I might add that there is evidence of wider social objections to the alliance, but it is difficult to say how profoundly these objections were felt. France at the time was, of course, also afflicted by the strife arising from the struggle between Protestants and Catholics, and the objections that we see tend to be subsumed into these debates. So it's not clear how their relative importance within French society. But the thesis that I wish to propose in a sort of general way is that the justifications can be characterized more or less in these three ways. There is a sort of utilitarian justification, which is that the alliance serves the greater good of Christendom, a natural law justification, which in many ways is the most interesting because it takes for one of its premises that Turkish society, Turkish government is fundamentally legitimate and therefore has the same natural law rights as other societies, other political, other governments. And then there is a circumscriptive or providentialist position, which isn't really made so much within the kind of diplomatic and sort of propagandist writing of the period, but is much more characteristic of the royal servants trying to justify the alliance to themselves. Now, my interest in this comes out of teaching, this subject, I should say, comes out of teaching rather than strictly out of research interests, which, though they are Mediterranean, tend to be on an earlier period. This comes from a module that I teach on the Mediterranean between 1453 and 1803, expressly informed by the work of Fernand Braudel. And the module sets out to interrogate the rather tendentious characterization of all manner of human phenomena as Mediterranean. Anyone who has read Braudel's evocation of the global Mediterranean will recognize the awkwardness of giving this geographical appellation to human behavior. I don't want to have a big historiographical discussion, but what I do think is that there is a Mediterranean experience that can be characterized as emotional or spiritual, and which is entailed in the encounters between different peoples, mediated, as it were, by seawater. And what I'm specifically interested in here, in the Franco-Turkish, Franco-Ottoman, I should say, alliance, is really rhetorics and the way in which rhetorics offer a route into the emotional life and experience of those who practiced or experienced Mediterraneanness, and the way in which it enabled them to negotiate their identities within this sort of mixed environment. In the fullness of time, I would also like to explore connections or difference to theologies and philosophies of toleration, which are often considered as much more characteristically northern development, the product of the stalemate between Protestant and Catholic. But that must wait for now, but I'll flag it when I get to it. Now, ultimately, I should give you a few caveats. Ultimately, I'm talking about a moment. The French connection with the Ottomans, although it's periodically revived in later centuries, most importantly under Louis XIV, the shock doesn't last very long, it should be said. Once joint military operations cease and France's trading relationship becomes the norm, commentaries on the alliance, although they occasionally come up, although they occasionally reflect on these connections, they don't tend to be as controversial. They don't tend to be as vivid, I suppose. And I will, generally speaking, only be discussing the experience of alliance up until 1546. And this is an important date because it's then that the embassy of Gabriel d'Aremont sets out, and this was treated as specifically as a scientific and scholarly expedition, and it generated a huge number of publications, which, while important, are too capacious and wide-ranging to be considered now. And therefore, I can only discuss in passing the really outré thought of individuals like Guillaume Postel, who was part of said embassy, who imagined a reconciliation of East and West, though it must be said that his ideas were only unconventional up to a point. He was still a proponent of crusade, but he's unusual in that he pretty much uniquely argued that there was a place for the Quran in Catholic spirituality. Thinking of this type didn't completely disappear with Postel. There's also Émeric de Crousset in the 17th century, who had a notion that it might be possible to form a monetary and political union with the Ottoman Empire, a sort of proto-EU, only somewhat more inclusive, where the Ottoman Emperor would occupy a station just below the Pope. We can maybe say more about that when we talk in the question period. I mention them now just to say that the range of thinkable thoughts in the 16th century is perhaps somewhat wider than we might imagine. And, yes, no, that's right. The other caveat to which I've already sort of alluded is that the work represents, my work represents really only a small section or cadre within French society. The attitude of the crown to the question of domestic public perception is perhaps best summarized by the account of the physician and diarist Honoré de Valbelle, who witnessed the arrival of Ottoman emissaries in Marseille in 1534. He reports that there came a proclamation from the king that no one should do anything displeasing to the said Turks, who arrived before the market hall, and they went through the town as if they were in Constantinople. French subjects were obliged not to interfere with the alliance, but they were not on the whole obliged to like it. There was some effort at domestic propaganda, some of the diplomatic correspondence that the French sent out to other countries was other realms was published in French. But even in royal servants, those who had to facilitate the alliance, compliance was much more important than enthusiasm. But it's in those servants and their writings that we really see efforts being made to reconcile themselves with the situation, drawing on those intellectual threads that were available in the propaganda and the diplomatic writing. There is a paradox of official friendliness and public hostility. The French crown, for example, did not support the Knights of St. John, which is a military order left over after the Crusades, who waged a continuous sea war, basically piracy, against the Ottomans, when their island of Malta was besieged by the Ottomans in 1565. And that, even though most of the knights were French, the French crown didn't support them. But the king still authorized, according to at least one printed record, still authorized celebrations when the knights were able to fight off their attackers after several months of frankly ludicrous violence. The French also did not join the Holy League in 1570 and were not present at the Battle of Lepanto, except in the person of the Knights of St. John, because of the inadvisability, presumably, of alienating as powerful an ally as the Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, pamphlets printed in France suggest not only broad public support for the League, but even public celebrations in Lyon, once again, as the quotation on the board illustrates. And the final caveat I want to bring up is just that a lot of the arguments that I will be presenting are fundamentally bad faith arguments. They are shot through with inconsistency and hypocrisy. Since many had a particular target audience, what was said to one constituency differed from what was said to others. So don't expect this to be altogether coherent. They were not coherent. It is rhetoric, but nonetheless, since rhetoric had to be convincing, it is still useful to look at it. World politics being what it is today, it may be some small comfort also to discover that there is nothing new under the sun. I should say there are a lot of quotations. For the sake of brevity, I will not read them all out, but if anyone wants us to return to them during the question period, please do just say. Also, I'm not going to say a vast amount about the Ottoman view, but if you are interested, I can discuss it a little in the questions period. Some background will be necessary to understand the situation and why France initially reached out to the Ottomans. So here are our main players: Francis I, Charles V, and Suleiman the Magnificent. As to their respective realms, I'm going to talk about the French, the Ottomans, and the imperialists. All three are multi-ethnic, multilinguistic empires, but Francis was the king of France. The Ottoman Empire was Turkish, but in the sense that the ruling class were Muslims and Turkish speakers, but as you almost certainly already know, the empire was vast, and the Ottoman sultans and their chancellery habitually referred to the empire as the lands of the House of Osman, rather than some sort of ethnic appellation. Charles V here is most often remembered as the Holy Roman Emperor, but far from being a German, he was a polyglot but mostly French-speaking Burgundian who spent much of his life traveling around Europe. His partisans came from all over his empires, and they are generally called imperialists at the time, which is how I'm going to discuss them. Now, when Charles became Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, he had among his many titles, which covered pages and pages when they were written down, a claim to the Duchy of Milan. And this was a territory that Francis, King of France, had conquered in the first year of his reign back in 1515. And the dispute over this territory led to a war, the details of which are not important, but which ended in 1525 with the complete obliteration of a French army at Pavia, and worse yet, the capture of King Francis himself. Francis spent a year imprisoned, and from this unprepossessing negotiating position, he would have to agree to a humiliating treaty in 1526. The details, again, are not very important because Francis reneged on most of them. But the important fact is that it was this defeat that drove him into the arms of the third player, Suleiman I, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. 1526 was also an important year for Suleiman. It was the year that he turned the Kingdom of Hungary into an Ottoman vassal, paving the way for its much later, well, somewhat later, annexation. The empire had expanded dramatically in the 16th century. In his comparatively short reign, the Sultan's father, Selim the Grim, had magnified the scale and the prestige of the empire enormously by conquering the Mamluk territories of Egypt, the Levant, and Arabia. The Ottoman military was also was already by that stage second to none. And after that point, the sultans were able to lavish resources on their army and navy like no other contemporary European power. They were really the only state in Europe with a standing professional navy and army. Suleiman began his reign by embarking on a series of swift and, to onlookers in Europe, profoundly shocking conquests in the 1520s. Suleiman had already driven the Knights of St. John from Rhodes in 1521 and conquered Belgrade in 1522. Partly in response to Habsburg maneuvering, Suleiman invaded Hungary, defeated and killed its king at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. He installed his own satrap, John Zapolya, a turn of events that left the way open to Ducal Austria and Vienna, which was besieged in 1529, though the Ottomans ultimately retreated. Now, at this stage, there is a risk of getting embroiled in a narrative of events and never really getting around to the core of the paper. Since I will be drawing material from a variety of points in the course of Franco-Ottoman relations, I'm going to have a timeline at the edge of the screen to make it easier to follow where in the relationship we're talking about. So some general points. So diplomacy begins after the Battle of Pavia in 1526. The initial move seems actually to have come from Francis's mother, Louise de Savoy, who was regent while he was imprisoned. There was another ambassador dispatched in 1528, and then Ottoman missions arrive in 1533 and 1534. The first permanent French embassy with the Ottomans is dispatched in 1535. It should be remembered that the Ottomans do not send permanent embassies to anybody else. The idea of having an ambassador present permanently at your court is emblematic of the superiority of the Ottoman Sultan. Submission is an important aspect of Ottoman diplomatic relations in this period. First military operations take place in 1537, and they don't go well. The Ottoman military is much better organized than the French, and they are never able to coordinate because the Ottomans are, generally speaking, much more able to organize and deploy their forces than the French are. The French very rarely contribute in a serious sort of way, certainly to the maritime campaigns, although they do fight some really quite brutal wars against land wars against Charles V. In 1538, Francis makes a separate peace with Francis. In 1541, though, his ambassador to the Ottomans is murdered by Habsburg agents, and this is one of the pretexts for the reinitiation of the war in 1542. This involves the Ottoman fleet at one point overwintering in Toulon, and Francis actually has the town emptied of its inhabitants, except for the heads of households, and the Ottomans are basically billeted within the now vacant houses. In 1544, you have the Treaty of Crepy, and France makes yet another separate peace with Charles V. And in 1547, Francis dies. There are some further joint military operations in the 1550s when Henry II becomes King of France, but that really is the last occasion on which it sort of happens, or at least, you know, in the century. So, moving on to the arguments. So the utilitarian argument, among the most frequent justifications, one that comes up time and time again, is that Francis is somehow able to mitigate the harm that the Ottomans would be able to do to Christendom. The alliance, it was argued, was best for everyone. This is actually related to a much earlier stage in actually Franco-Papal diplomacy, in which the threat posed by the Turk to Italy and Germany was used to leverage concessions from the Pope in exchange for financial support. Specifically, Francis wanted a pro-French judgment in the question of the possession of Milan. It was, in fact, a strategy that was actually used by Henry VIII as well for his great cause, the question of the divorce from Catherine of Aragon, so much so that Francis was actually able to make a virtue of their joint resistance, though the two never really identified with one another's objectives. And we can see this, for example, in the letter up here on the board of August 1532, sent from Francis I to his ambassador in Rome, in which essentially Francis is saying that the Pope must get Europe's house in order, i.e., give concessions to myself and the King of England before anything can actually be done about the Turks. And as we can also see, the foundational premise of this rhetoric is the claim that the King of France, along to some extent with his allies, is the true defender and leader of Christendom, a pointed counterclaim to that of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. And it is this premise that underpinned Francis's utilitarian argument. Now, it was impossible to conceal dealings with the Ottomans. As early as March 1532, the dispatch of ambassadors to Constantinople had been noticed and commented on, as this letter from the Bishop of Auxerre, the ambassador in Rome, shows. The presence of Ottoman emissaries on French soil was likewise impossible to miss. We've already heard from Honoré de Valbel, imperial sources, the state papers of Cardinal Granvelle, who was one of Charles V's chief ministers, show that they certainly knew about the diplomatic dealings as early as January 1534 and probably earlier. And the French were very clear-eyed about this, and far from trying to conceal their activities, what they obfuscated about was their motive. Indeed, they were prepared to vaunt them. They were prepared to say, look at us, we are making contact with the Ottomans. And the reason for that is that they were presented as an alternative to the military schemes of the Habsburgs. And there's a sense in which this was not altogether unfounded, but Francis can hardly be accused of altruistic motives when he tried to change Ottoman strategy in ways that would be beneficial to himself. Francis was, in fact, expressly declaring his connection with the Ottomans as early as 1534, and in doing so, he presented his diplomacy as an effort on Christendom's behalf, as this letter from Charles V to his ambassador in France illustrates. And this idea returns again and again, even when the French have started fighting in concert with the Ottomans, and it became that much harder to convince people of the truth of it. In 1543, when a French ambassador travels with the Ottoman fleet so as to identify legitimate targets in Naples, Jean de Montluc, another French emissary, attempted to vindicate his presence there to the Venetian Senate by declaring that in doing so, he restrained the admiral, the notorious Chierdine Barbarossa, from doing more extensive damage. And I will read this particular one out. The great and powerful army of the most serene prince, that is, the Sultan, left Constantinople being composed of soldiers foreign to our religion, and being sent to the aid of the king, my lord. It passed through the midst of your islands, stopped in the lands of the church, traversed the lands of the Sienese and Genoese, people who more gladly favor the grandeur of the emperor than their own freedom, but it cannot be heard, nor found out that anyone complains of any grief. But they used every courtesy and gave free passage to all, those who were encountered at sea, and paid for all that was needed for their provision and the supply of the army in the countries passing by, which could not, I believe, have happened but for the presence of Captain Paulin, the king's ambassador, so that never in the past have either Turks or Christians behaved so modestly. Who will he be, most serene prince, who could or would want to deny that if the army had not been restrained by his majesty, the king, my master, for the defense of his frontiers, that Christianity would have been attacked with infinite losses? We can also see that mitigation of this kind was an important way in which successive French ambassadors to the Ottomans reconciled themselves with their role. Repeatedly, we hear of French ambassadors ransoming and protecting the Christian victims and prisoners of their allies. Jean Gallery, a physician serving with Saint-Blancard, who led the French galleys that joined the Turkish fleet in 1537, reported that the ambassador provided refuge to Christians fleeing a town called Gazopoli. It's not known to where this actually refers to. when it was attacked by the Ottomans. Jérôme Morin, a clerk traveling with Captain Paulin, reports that the captain, the ambassador, ransomed some of the Christians taken by Kheireddin in 1544 when he returned to Constantinople. And a little later, Jean de Chesneau, in his account of the embassy of Gabriel d'Aramon, reports that in 1548, the ambassador secured the release of several Knights of St. John who were captured at Tripoli. Such interventions, I want to stress, are dubiously virtuous at best. If the people rescued were in danger, it was danger at which the ambassadors had quite clearly connived, particularly in the case of Captain Paulin, who was responsible for pointing out viable targets to Kheireddin. But what they were trying to do was place a barrier between themselves and their putative allies to try and separate themselves morally from the consequences of their actions. And this idea of mitigation seems to have been one of the arguments that really worked domestically. Writing at the end of the century, the great biographer Pierre de Bourdeille, Seigneur de Brantôme, when writing about the alliance, repeated Montluc's canard about Paulin's restraining effect on the Ottoman fleet, and also made another baseless claim that Suleiman had had plans to destroy the Holy Sepulchre, from which act Francis had apparently dissuaded him. The second major line of defence is what I am for now calling the natural law defence. The name is something of a placeholder. I'm not exactly sure how to characterise this argument because elements of it are in fact secularizing, while others are quite theological in tone. And what I mean by secularizing in this sense is the sense of extricating the conflict between the Habsburgs and Ottomans from any kind of religious or cosmological significance, not that there was a secularizing ideology that we can point to. And we mostly see this argument being deployed in Italy to try and detach Charles's allies from the emperor. To speak of raison d'état would be something of an anachronism at this stage. We might talk about Machiavellian policies, but the risk is that we simply lapse into value judgment. But what is true is that France's alliance with the Ottomans was of a piece with other anti-Habsburg policies that risked compromising its Catholic identity, including, but not limited to, alliance with England, the Le Promeret Treaty, or Treaty of Closer Amity in 1532, and the support of and appeals to German Protestants. And we can also point out that cynical self-interest could function as a defense of sorts, at least in the short term, because it required no, and it was useful, of course, because it required no ideological commitment and no principle to defend it. When quizzed by the Venetian ambassador in 1534, Francis responded with what's on the board. Monsieur Ambassadeur, I cannot deny that I very much desire to see the Turk powerful and ready for war, not for his sake, since he's an infidel and the rest of us are Christians, but to weaken the power of the emperor and force him to great expenses and to reassure other governments against so great an enemy. But in the longer term, it was much harder to reconcile a cynical position with the religious style and religious commitments of the French monarchy. So rather than try to defend a point of religious principle, what French diplomats found is that it was much easier to try and rob the conflict of its primarily religious character. That is to say that this is not a conflict between Christendom and Islam. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that while I have taken great pains to collect justifications of the alliance proper in this period, justifying cooperation with the Turks wasn't strictly the main goal of French diplomatic rhetoric in this period. A lot of what French diplomats were up to was trying to undermine the diplomatic efforts of Charles V and to undermine fundamentally his claim to be the legitimate defender and leader of Christendom. That in and of itself is actually very revealing about the way that the French felt about their alliance with the Turk, because when referred to the canons of rhetoric, the traditional classical ways in which you structure a persuasive argument, when referred to that, this practice of trying to bring an opponent into contempt is indicative of or characteristic of a causa turpis, a bad cause, that is to say, a position that is difficult to defend. And virtually all the texts that I discuss as part of this study return to this theme. Charles is personally responsible for inducing Turkish attacks on Germany and Italy by pressing the claims of his brother Ferdinand, the King of the Romans, in Hungary, against those of the Turkish vassal whom I mentioned, the Ottoman vassal I mentioned, John Zapolya. Moreover, French diplomacy with the Ottomans was often compared to that of the Habsburgs, with insinuations that their objections to the alliance of the French and the Ottomans were just the product of envy. Enormous mileage, for example, was extracted from a 1533 treaty in which Ferdinand acknowledged Suleiman's suzerainty and agreed to pay an annual tribute to Suleiman in exchange for minor concessions in Western Hungary. More mileage still was derived from the presence of German Protestants within Charles's ranks and their acts of iconoclasm in Italy. And here is an example from Jean de Montluc's speech to the Venetian Senate. But the important detail was that in blaming Charles and Ferdinand for Ottoman attacks, Francis presented this war as being a conflict between princes, not a war between religions. Further, what this entailed was the application of a natural law principle, the right of self-defense or defense of one's interests to both an excommunicate, John Zapolya, and by extension, his Muslim ally, Suleiman. A good example of what I mean is a letter that was sent to the Pope in 1542, and which was actually published in French, so possibly as a propaganda effort, the following year as Translation de l'Epistre du Roi très Chrétien François. And in a manner wholly inappropriate to a diplomatic letter, which is what leads me to think that possibly this is not what it actually is, Francis lectures the Pope on the common origin of humanity, as you can see in this quotation. And what we see here is, in effect, a tacit acknowledgement of the legitimacy of Islamic statehood, or rather, as being a legitimate human political organization within the ambit, as it were, of natural law rights. And it isn't the first such acknowledgement by Catholic power, but nonetheless, given the tone of European discussion of the Ottomans in the 16th century, it represents a considerable diminution of the sense of threat. But in doing this, Francis's defenders went a step further. And here it is that the argument turns on a point that approaches theology, specifically the question of whether a Christian prince has the freedom to appeal to a non-Christian prince for help. And the question arises as early as the aforementioned letter to the Pope in 1542. Francis, or rather whoever it was who drafted the letter for him, invokes the example of the Good Samaritan and the epistles to suggest that the example of Christ himself shows that a prince need not exclude non-Christians from his dealing. It's written in a sort of rhetorical patois, so it's dubiously grammatical. And from there, it is a short jump to adducing, as you can see in the second paragraph at the bottom, scriptural examples in which Jewish monarchs sought military help from their pagan neighbors. The letter makes the point in brief: what ancient or more recent history cannot produce examples of confederations of peoples very discordant in religion or manners. The alliances of David and Solomon and of other kings with idolaters are witnessed by Holy Scripture. And it finds a much fuller expression in 1543 and Jean de Montluc's speech to the Venetian Senate. And interestingly, it's worth saying again, with reference to the canons of rhetoric, its placement in the speech suggests that it was considered one of the stronger arguments, rhetorical dogma dictating that you begin and end your oration with your stronger points, placing the weaker ones in the middle. No doubt this is partly because he was speaking to the Venetians, who had a much longer history of commerce with the Ottomans than the French did. And Jean de Montluc goes on to adduce non-scriptural examples, but the point that he is trying to make is emphatically theological, or at least counter to the theological point being made by his imperial opponents. The fact that Montluc makes this point is actually especially interesting because later he became involved in efforts to reconcile French Protestants and Catholics, to the extent that he was actually declared a heretic for those efforts and stripped of his bishopric. And going forward, I want to see if there's any sense in which Montluc brings a Mediterranean inflection to the Reformation discourses of toleration. Now, I'm running out of time, so I will address the last justification more briefly and with just one example. The third line of defense was to suggest that the alliance was purely temporary, with the implication that customary hostilities would be resumed later. This is a line that was sometimes used in official sources, although not in a sort of prospective sense. Jean de Montluc, for example, confronted the Venetians with France's historical record, listing the wars that they had had with Muslim opponents as evidence that France did not deserve the disapprobation that was directed at them by the emperor's partisan. But defenses of this kind are much more characteristic of royal servants trying to frame their own experiences. So, for example, Jean de Vega, who also wrote a manuscript narration of the travels of Baron Saint-Blancard, the commander of the fleet sent to assist Suleiman and Kheireddin in 1537, has a point in his narrative where he mentions the celebration of a religious service, and it's the only time that he does this. He breaks off from his narrative of the voyage to describe the French fleet traveling away from the Ottomans to the Church of Saint Mary of Cassiope on the island of Corfu, which at that point was under attack by the Ottomans. And there they celebrate Mass. Now, when they come to the church, they find that it has been wrecked by the Sultan's army. It's unroofed and defaced with dead bodies before the doors. In spite of the damage done by their allies, Saint-Blancard and his crew erect an altar and celebrate Mass amid the devastation. In the course of the account, Vega also describes an incident where an image of the Virgin Mary miraculously struck blind one of the Turkish soldiers that was desecrating the church. Now, be under no illusions, soldiers sack churches in this period. It really doesn't matter what religion they are, as the sack of Rome, with its many dozens of pillaged churches by an army of mostly Catholic Spaniards, illustrates. It would be specious in the extreme to suggest that the discovery of a ruined church would be particular to this war zone. But the question is really, why is it in the narrative? Why does Vega choose to separate his protagonists, so to speak, from their allies and present them as worshipping at the shrine of a saint who had so recently asserted her dominance over the heathen? And the point, I think, is that the purported miracle offers confirmation of what Vega believed to be divine order. Divine retribution. Christianity would, it seems, ultimately prevail. The Frenchman's choice to celebrate Mass in this shrine then symbolically reaffirmed, despite everything, their commitment to and faith in this ineluctable order. The alliance to the Ottomans was, for Vega, only a brief aberration from the trajectory of history. In conclusion, I want to reiterate that so far as the diplomatic discourse is concerned, we are dealing with rhetoric. But I also want to emphasize that I do not mean this in a pejorative sense. I do not mean mere rhetoric. If we accept that these arguments were meant to be persuasive and were in some sense persuasive, they are a way into understanding the anxieties and intellectual resources of the Christian Mediterranean polities and the persons confronted not only with difference, but also with the fact of interfaith cooperation. And I do stress also, by the way, that this is the Christian experience. Muslims, foundationally tolerant as Islam was and is, did not have the same problems. Yet surprisingly, in the middle of two major religious confrontations between Christian and Muslim and between Catholic and Protestant, it was possible for French Catholics to find justifications for and argue for a quasi-theological rationale for this cooperation. More research is needed to discover exactly how convincing these arguments ultimately were, and whether they fed into later and wider discourses of toleration, or indeed whether these arguments represented a kind of intellectual dead end, abandoned with when the rhetorical need for them was ended. Thank you very much.